Louisa had decided very early on that she wanted to be a writer and that she wanted to make money. Two things which, of course, do not always go together. So she struggled and struggled to make herself into a writer. She had written some, what she called her blood and thunder stories for Frank Leslie's Illustrated News, very melodramatic stories, which she was ashamed of, and she wrote them under a pseudonym. She had published some poems, she had published some stories, and in 1854, when she was 21, she decided that she would really, become a writer, and that she would go and see the great editor of her time, of their time, James T. Fields. James T. Fields was Hawthorne's editor, he was De Quincey's editor, he was the man who would become the sort of Maxwell Perkins of the 1840s and 50s, a very famous guy. So Louisa had been, she made money, some money from writing, some money from being a seamstress, some money from teaching, and she had gone to be a companion to a man who turned out to be very unpleasant in New Hampshire. And she had been there for 6 weeks, and she wrote an essay about it called When I Went Out to Service. So she thought she would take this memoir essay to James Fields and see what he thought, and he would anoint her as a writer, and she would be on her way. So I'm reading again. She passed the Boston Common and turned into the bustling center of downtown. There the spire of the Old South Church presided like a disapproving Puritan dowager over the teeming business of the New Boston. There was the bookshop next to Mrs. Abner's coffee house, where Fields took authors and colleagues for coffee and hot buns. There was the gorgeous palace of the music hall with its golden gaslit interiors, where Louisa had already been to see Madame Henriette Sontag sing Rossini, and where she had recently gone to hear Theodore Parker, one of her favorite speakers and a fervent abolitionist, demand equality for women. Now Louisa headed for the second floor of the old corner bookshop, where Fields had his office behind a green curtain that separated him from his young assistant, Thomas Niles, and the piles of manuscripts he had yet to read. She handed him the manuscript, her first and last memoir essay, How I Went Out to Service. He motioned her to sit and began to read. She could hear the noise of Thomas Niles' pen scratching and the chatter in the bookstore downstairs. The air smelled of paper and ink. Finally, the great James T. Fields, you know what's going to happen, looked up at her and delivered the verdict she would remember for the rest of her life. Stick to your teaching, Miss Alcott, you can't write. But of course, this is the moment at which she actually became a writer. As you all who are writers know, if you don't thrive on discouragement, you are not going to make it as a writer. I often think that the principal engine behind most writing is perversity. It may be that the principal engine behind most success is perversity. I mean, now there are these psychological studies that say we should have said to our children, you'll never amount to anything, so that they could have spent their energy proving us wrong, instead of saying to our children, you can do whatever you want, and they did whatever they wanted. But Louisa had this perversity, and you can see it in the apple scene, and you can see it all the way through her life, so that when James T. Fields said to her, you can't write, something inside her went, oh yes, I can. And I do think this is a very, very interesting moment, but her trials were not over. She then decided that she was going to write a serious novel. And her serious novel, which I'm sure not many of you read, was called Moods. And it's a novel about a young woman who goes on a river trip with two men, one a man very much like Henry David Thoreau, who she had a desperate crush on, and another, a man very much like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who she also had a crush on. And these three people travel up the river, and she ends up marrying the Emerson character and then realizing that she's in love with the Thoreau character. And it's a terrible book, and they all die in a shipwreck. That's how she solved the problem. But she thought it was a terrific book. She started it with an epigraph from Emerson, and she worked very hard on it. She had to cut it in half to get it published. That may sound familiar. And it finally came out in 1864, and it got terrible reviews. And the worst review it got was from a young man named Henry James, who was writing for the North American Review. And he wrote that what Alcott was trying to do in Moods had already been done better in Europe, and that her doctrine of affinities, which is what Moods was supposed to be about, made no sense. And then he wrote, "We are utterly weary of stories about precocious little girls. The two most striking facts with regard to Moods are the author's ignorance of human nature and her self-confidence in spite of that ignorance." I just want to say, I think for Louisa May Alcott, the stick to your teaching line stayed in her mind. And she wrote a letter in 1871, long after she was beloved and wealthy and famous. She wrote a little letter to James Fields that I'm going to read to you. "Dear Mr. Fields," Louisa wrote, "once upon a time you lent me $40, kindly saying that I might return them when I had made a pot of gold. As the miracle has been unexpectedly wrought, I wish to fulfill my part of the bargain and herewith repay my debt with many thanks. Very truly yours, Louisa May Alcott." So I want to suggest a little bit that it isn't just perversity that is the engine for writing. There's a little bit of revenge in there. And I feel that when she sat down to write this letter to thank him for the $40 that she loaned him so that she could teach better, it was a tremendously satisfying moment.